And we will share those slides and those contacts, and if you want to get in touch with Jane or the team, please do so. Okay, I'm not going to introduce our next guest, but I'm going to ask Kylie, my co-collaborator in what we've been putting together in terms of the Ending Loneliness Now series of workshops. Kylie from Community Centres SA, welcome to the stage, and I'll let you do the introduction.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. How nice it is to be joining with our friends at Uniting Communities. Community Centres SA, of course, is the peak body that supports 103 community centres around the state, and the 35,000 odd people and the 20,000 odd volunteering hours each week. Those stats are always important. Community connection, of course, is in our DNA, I guess. It's the space that we love and we breathe. So we're delighted to be sitting here with you all this morning, and particularly delighted to be able to welcome four preeminent politicians here to speak to you this morning about their party's aspirations and views about addressing loneliness. I might invite the four to the stage now, and I'll introduce you each separately. Come on up, all four of you. Michelle, you might like to sit closest to me, your first cab off the rank. I might go Connie second, Nat third. They didn't know the order. So what a time, hey, leading up to elections when we're, really taking a deep dive into what is really another pandemic around the world. And throughout the day, of course, you'll hear more and more of the evidence and the activities on the ground that really can address loneliness in very deep and meaningful ways. First off, Minister Michelle Lensink, well known to us all, representing the Liberal Party, and of course the Minister for Human Services. Michelle's portfolio, I think, includes, and I'm sure I'll forget some, but youth, disability, volunteering, social inclusion, housing, loneliness, etc., etc. So, of course, this space of community connectedness is right at the heart of your world. So we're very interested to hear about the Liberal Party's views around how, going forward, you will really address this terrible pandemic that we call loneliness, and how the party will really work towards nurturing those meaningful connections that we just heard so eloquently Jane talk to us about. So over to you, Minister Lensink. I will just say I'm going to ask each guest to speak for around about 7 minutes, and then we will have a bit of a Q&A. So if you've got questions, I believe now
we're going to have Slido up on the
Slido will be working.
There, and you can actually
correct.
There you go. So if you point your camera.
And if you're not comfortable doing that because, the sense of modern technology starts to result in those quivers in your body, then we can come to the old-fashioned way with the microphone, and you can ask a question as well. So hold the questions for the moment. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kylie, and thank you for inviting us all to be here today. Can I start by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the Kaurna people and that we pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And we respect the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, and respect their cultural and heritage beliefs as still as important to the living Kaurna people today. Can I also acknowledge my parliamentary colleagues, Nat Cook, the Shadow Minister for Human Services, Rob Sims and Connie Benares, my colleagues from the State Upper House, and also Kylie from Community Centres, and Simon Shrapple and everybody who's here today. We're very grateful for both organisations for putting on this forum today, because it does highlight something that is incredibly important in our community, and obviously Jane has outlined some of the research behind it and developing themes going forward. So it's clearly something that I think is a bit of a no-brainer for political parties to say that yes, we understand that loneliness is a problem, community connectedness clearly has links to much better mental health outcomes, probably social and economic outcomes for individuals as well. So I think that's probably the starting point, the jumping off point for everyone. And I'd like to acknowledge Community Centres SA and Uniting Communities for the range of good work that you all do in this space, which is multi-layered. I visit a lot of different non-government organisations, and apart from the individual programs, whether they're in the child protection space or the homelessness space, there always is that underlying connection with connecting people, helping them on their journey. So I think it really needs to, that's obviously a baseline that we start from. We know that from the data, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare suggests that around 1 in 10 people experience social isolation. Obviously it's increased because of COVID, and that has a negative effect on health outcomes and the like. It's been interesting just reading through the work that has been done by your organisations about loneliness, the surveys. We're all, I think the journey for older people is something that we naturally understand, but including younger people in this is important, and clearly we need to have different ways of connecting for different generations, different cultures and the like, because what everybody wants is different. So we've had this experience in my family recently with my dad, whose memory has been going on the slide. He's been living alone for 2.5 years with some aged care support, and the last time he went missing in a car for 10 hours, we kind of went, we've got to do something about this. But he has been telling his workers that he's lonely, and as busy as my sister and I are, we sat with him with his last ACAT, and he didn't want to go to the men's shed, was not interested, flat out refused. But we managed to connect him with a Dutch club, except he complained, because Dutch people always complain, that there weren't enough Dutch people there. But the whole issue has been resolved because he's now in respite with my mum. So, but while he was living with me, we had the interesting experience of 3 generations under one roof, so you'd kind of think, that might work. But it really struck me how he's got his own interests. He would rather watch SBS or Midsummer Murders, and my 6-year-old wants to play Minecraft, and my husband wants to do some wargaming thing with his Xbox, and I just kind of stood back and got the TV at 10 o'clock at night every Friday night. So I guess that just illustrates that we've all got different interests, and there was an aspect to him being with us that he's connected with my mum in a way he's not with us. So, yeah, it is. There's horses for courses, and I think we need to understand that. So what I wanted to do is sort of, and I have actually had this all prepared for me, because when we lay it out, there's quite a lot that we've been doing, particularly through the Department of Human Services. So a number of you would be familiar with the Community Connections program, which is new, which started on the 1st of July last year, and it's evolved out of reforming the old home and community care program. It supports people 18 to 64 years, or 49 for Aboriginal people, whose independence and quality of life is at risk and who are unable to benefit from alternative services. So really those people who aren't connected to services at the moment, but need to be connected. And you can understand that there is that resistance with some people, which Jane talked about quite clearly. So that program provides clients with 12 weeks of targeted support, and is all about community connection. So I've had really good feedback when I've gone around the state in regional areas, or here in Adelaide, from organisations about the success of that program, that it really fills a gap for that group of people. And priority is given to unpaid carers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people from new and emerging culturally, linguistically diverse communities, people who are financially disadvantaged, and people living in communities of persistent or location-based disadvantage. So we're very pleased with how that's going. It's in the try, test, learn phase at the moment, but early reports are good. We've also got the Community Services Support Program, the Community and Neighbourhood Development Program, which provides funding to community centres, as you know, and neighbourhood houses, which also aims to improve participation. We've also got the Grants SA program, which is an important bolster for lots of organisations. Someone's going to give me time in a minute, aren't they? Are you checking? Okay. Okay, thank you. So we've had particular themes for Grants SA, which have been connecting, belonging, aspiring and creating, which have all been in that community space. So we know that a number of centres have benefited from that particular funding. We partnered, I should say, with the Faith Fuller Foundation in 2021, and so that's the Our Town Community Wellbeing Initiatives are in Pinaroo, Malang and the Barossa, and that's very much of the same theme, and they're employing community connectors themselves through the youth programs. We've had a Youth Connection project in Port Pirie and Port Augusta, which is a partnership between Wellbeing SA, the Department of Human Services and the Australian Centre for Social Innovation. So that works under our Strong Futures, the Youth Action Plan. And youth mental health is a key priority of the Strong Futures with the 5 Ways to Wellbeing campaign, which was launched in August last year. We've got some other new projects under the plan to engage specific cohorts. Carers SA has been engaged to undertake a pilot program to implement key recommendations from the Commissioner for Children and Young People's report, and engaging the South Australian Rainbow Alliance to build the capacity of young LGBTIQA plus South Australian leaders with a focus on strengthening peer support approaches. So I hope that demonstrates that through our various funding arrangements, we've been committed to particular projects which have helped in the community connection space and that would remain an ongoing priority for a re-elected national Liberal government. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Sorry to cut you off there at the last minute. And can I just say thank you too for sharing the story about your dear dad. Loneliness is very real, and you know your story illustrates that it impacts on all of us in very deep ways. So thank you for that. Welcome, Connie Benares. Connie was elected to the Legislative Council in 2018, I believe, as a member of SA Best. And I know amongst the many issues that your party advocates for, you're a staunch supporter of gender equality and minimising impacts of gambling and also of child protection. You also recognise the importance of not-for-profits in really supporting that sort of psychosocial space. So we're very interested to hear more about SA Best and your views around loneliness. Welcome to the lectern.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me here today. Can I start by acknowledging my parliamentary colleagues as well, but more importantly, all of you who are here this morning. I don't need to tell you in this room about loneliness and isolation. I think you all know what we're talking about. But I think one of the most tragic outcomes that I do want to talk about of the COVID-19 pandemic is that the health priority in this country around the world has intensified, and its impacts on the community have yet to be measured. We know the full impacts of COVID-19 are not going to be realised for 3 to 5 years, particularly when it comes to mental health. And we know the cohort that will be most impacted are our children and young people. And it's exposed more cracks in our preventative health and our health system than ever before. For me, the most tragic and gut-wrenching outcomes of the pandemic have been those who have had lonely, isolated deaths in hospitals and in nursing homes, separated from their families and loved ones when they're at their most vulnerable. In many cases for our elderly, they didn't comprehend why their loved ones weren't there, why they weren't there to hold their hand or to give them a hug as they slipped away. And loved ones have been left behind to grieve, knowing that they couldn't be there for those who have left them. It's been cruel and it's been callous. And who knows the impact of loneliness on those who have been left behind. You can be surrounded by family, by loved ones, by friends, by colleagues, and still be extraordinarily lonely. And I think I probably speak for all of us when I say that we probably all know people who are in that precise predicament. And as I've said, the true COVID impacts are still years away, and it concerns us greatly how our young people in particular are going to be impacted. One thing we haven't talked openly enough about during this pandemic, in my view, is the suicide rates that are occurring and that are going to follow. It was already the leading cause of death for young people aged 15 to 24. During lockdowns, we know young people were the most likely to feel increased loneliness as working from home and social distancing became the norm. The trend of men being more likely to be experiencing loneliness was flipped during COVID, with women now reporting more loneliness than men. And I don't need to tell you the leading causes of loneliness. I think we know those. I don't think any of us, though, could have foreseen the true impacts of COVID-19 and what they would have on us as a society, let alone the issues that we're discussing today. If there's one positive to be taken out of this God-forsaken pandemic, it is that it has shone a spotlight on loneliness and its impacts, and I think it's opened a more robust discussion about how we address it. We are here now. We've seen the devastating impacts on our people who are already lonely and the growing cohorts of people who are being impacted even more. And the question remains, what are we going to do to address it? We can't wait for the tsunami that's going to hit in 3 to 5 years, and we need a plan now going forward to navigate those uncharted waters that lay ahead. I'll tell you what I think won't work, and that's more of the same. Because what we've done to date has been completely devoid, in my view, of empathy and compassion. At every forum, I always say that we'll be guided by experts in the know. I've no doubt people who attended these forums are absolutely sick of me saying that, but that is the way that SA Best formulates its key policies. We turn to the experts in the know, we turn to people around in these rooms, and we ask them, what do we need to know? What do we need to do to get this right? On a personal level, SA Best is really thrilled to be joined by Dr. Kayvana Back, who's with us today, who does this work every day. It's his bread and butter work. So we are guided by him also in terms of our policy decisions. I spoke at a public health forum last week on preventative health. As a nation, we don't spend enough on preventative health. And as a state, we fare even worse. Australia-wide, only $2 billion, $89 per person is spent on prevention each year. In South Australia, that spend is a mere $58. We need to shift from reactive short-term thinking to proactive long-term thinking when investing in our preventative health measures, and that applies equally in this space. We do know we know that loneliness is a worldwide phenomenon. Other countries have recognised the long-term costs, and they've gone as far as dedicating ministers for loneliness. The UK and Japan governments have taken a globally leading role in this space, appointing a minister for loneliness in their countries. You don't need politicians or bureaucrats to tell you what you already know. We need to listen to what you are telling us. You need to engage. We need to engage with you and provide funding for the sorts of projects you've outlined in your election priorities. Here's a quick snapshot of some issues that we don't often think about when we talk about loneliness, I think. We know about the direct correlation between loneliness, poor physical and mental health, and premature death. There are studies that have shown the risk factors associated with obesity, studies that show that loneliness is as lethal as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Single parents are one of the highest groups to experience loneliness. Men who experience relationship breakups are more than 13 times more likely to develop loneliness than married men. Young men living in regional areas and underemployment and receiving impact support are also risk factors. As an MP who does not understand town boundaries, I can tell you I am not 100, I'm 1,000% guilty of doing all the wrong things when it comes to these risk factors. And throw an election in the mix, and I can promise you it's a recipe for disaster. Handing my son a device at the end of a busy working day is playing right into the hands of the risk factors associated with isolation. It's setting him up for failure, but it is such an easy option. And I can see the negative impact it has on him. Even the devices aren't working. This morning was a nightmare. I can promise you all that. So cue in extreme mother guilt. Right now, even my dog's feeling neglected and depressed. And I mention devices because I think it is one of the issues that we really need to target, because what we know is that a growing number of lonely kids online risk exposure to child exploitation. When you consider the shocking statistic that 500,000 child predators are out there online each and every day looking for your child, that should make you shudder. And it's not just our kids. Romance scams are notorious for targeting the lonely. In Australia in January this year, there were 267 reported romance scams, particularly targeting the over 65 age group. I'm not standing here pretending to hold a checkbook. We are not in government. We are not in opposition. We don't make those sorts of promises. But what I will guarantee you is that I can be pretty damn convincing about telling the people who hold the checkbook how they should spend their money. This is what we do in the upper house. This is why we need us there. We know the benefits of preventative health. The pandemic has exposed the cracks in what we think about public health and how it's funded. And it's emphasised the importance and benefits of prevention, which is much more cost effective than treatment during ordinary times, let alone during a pandemic. It's an absolute travesty. There hasn't been an increase at all in DHS funding for community centres, funding which has remained stagnant for the past 6 years, and that's despite those centres around the state being relied upon to pick up what is ultimately a government responsibility. The total proposed quantum of DHS funding committed going forward is still $3.4 million, and it will be distributed to about 49 of 103 community centres, so about half will miss out. Comparatively, across Australia, SA is the only state not to recognise the incredible value of these centres by funding them all. Across Australia, SA is the only state not to provide a minimum baseline of funding that will, at the very minimum, cover the cost of a singular staff member. This will result in centres the government has become reliant on closing their doors. So Michelle and Nat, I'm speaking to you now. We're looking to you to make this your government priority. What I can assure you is that as a member of the upper house, we will do our level best to ensure that whoever forms government will be held accountable and will ensure that no centres close their doors. On a closing note, though, I would like to just reference one thing that was said at the outset about the coalitions and give Michelle some credit here. Because on a personal level, I think Michelle and I have discussed this quite a bit, and we do see eye to eye on things that we think should be done where funding is available. And I think the umbrella organisation, the coalition, is an absolutely essential area that we should be looking at. I think it's one that Michelle, as Minister, and I have had discussions about if we brought everybody under the same umbrella rather than trying to work separately for the same cause. That is something that we should certainly be exploring and something that we'll be talking to whoever forms government about in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Connie. And again, for your personal story about your darling dog and his sense of loneliness. Mother guilt extreme this morning. I was at a health translation research get-together last week with a bunch of organisations talking about their interest in research going forward, and one of the key things that came up time and time again was around the connectedness between humans and animals and our pets. It's an incredibly important space. Those of you who are pet lovers will absolutely attest to that. On to that note, Nat Cook. Nat, I see, was at a dog park yesterday. Once again highlighting the importance of community infrastructure, those places that Jane spoke about this morning, those public spaces where people connect, how important they are, those non-stigmatised, inclusive places where people can just be in really addressing loneliness. Nat you're the member for Herschel Vale from the Australian Labor Party and Shadow Minister for Human Services. Welcome to the lectern.
Thank you so much for having me. I acknowledge stolen Kaurna land that's never been ceded. I pay my respects to Kaurna elders past, present and emerging. I also pay my respects to all elders across our great country and thank them for their long time custodianship. I think I just want to point out a few things that are obvious clearly. Number one, Connie read my speech, and actually, number two, I don't have a speech because I follow speeches really badly. But I do have some notes to pay respect to the importance of the opportunity to address people here today. Thank you and acknowledgement also to my parliamentary colleagues and all of the leaders in the room who I think I look at every table and have met with several of you individually, but also visited the incredible places that you work at, and thank you for what you do. Over the last couple of years, I think this has tipped normal on its head. We've gone from fire and flood to COVID, and I'll nick Peter Malinowskis' quote, which is that while COVID was the earthquake, mental health fallout is the tsunami. We have got thousands of lonely people across South Australia who are too terrified to leave their homes, people who have signs on their doors asking people not to come near the house. We have children that don't know what a community is that can be face-to-face and interacting and engaging within school environments, shops, sporting environments, whose parents are so terrified of what might happen to their kids should they catch COVID. I am with them. I have a 9-year-old that I am absolutely desperate to protect, but I know that no matter what cotton wool you put around your children, now I'm going to cry. Yeah. But no matter what cotton wool you put around your kids, they make choices, and it's up to us as a community, as policy makers, to ensure that those choices are safe and informed, that they have opportunity, enough rope to go up the tree and climb it, and then the sense and the skills to get down without face palming on the floor. Face planting, that's face palm. So I think there is this opportunity that we face now exiting COVID to really draw that line again and say these are the standards that we need to set for our community to engage and to connect. I think there are so many people in our community now that have become the new lonely that previously used to catch up for a cuppa with their neighbours. They used to attend the community centres without fear, to sit around and have a good yarn, to volunteer, to visit the nursing homes, to be community visitors who now just simply feel like they're unsure about the future of the safety around doing that. So we have got a massive, massive challenge. I think, look, the partisan part about it is that we have different policies than other parties. I do think all of us at the end point want people to stop being lonely. I think one of the advantages that I do have is that every day I go to my office, a different person turns up for porridge. A different person turns up because they no longer have any shoes. Kudos to my office staff. They don't have to do it. They'll run in and buy a pair of shoes out of their own pocket if they have to. This has happened more and more recently. We know where the people sleep in their cars, where they can't access services, or they're too frightened to access the services, or they're simply no longer there. We've talked about how do we pull this all together across the sector, which I presume we're talking the not-for-profit sector. How do we pull all these resources together and make sure that the right information is getting to the policymakers to ensure that the right decisions are made? We all know that round tables can provide information and they get put into the machine and they get spat out and everyone says, who actually said that? Who recommended that movement? Who recommended that policy change? Because I know the volunteering sector don't want the cuts and changes that are happening right now, because their organisations are facing an absolute cliff where they're going to be unable to visit people in nursing homes, unable to provide support to volunteers for really highly vulnerable groups, because someone decided their target needed to be multicultural youth, and that's about it. That doesn't work. Who recommended that? I can't imagine the volunteering organisations recommended that, but that's what they're left with. Community centres, you're faced with feedback that you've got to provide to a funding system that will see no rise in funding across 15 years, no capacity to renegotiate, and half of you not getting any of it. Did you recommend that? I don't think so. So in terms of that part of moving forward, what I commit to you is that we do reactivate. This isn't a new idea. Who was part of Together SA? Laugh, giggle, chuckle. I know there's paid members in here. That funding was cut. Whatever that you thought of that from a political point of view, it's a good idea. So this isn't a new idea, and we need to build a cat on that. I went to a meeting in a park over a decade ago talking about collaboration, results-based accountability, social impact, collective impact. Is it all ringing a bell? This, nods everywhere. It was a long time ago. I think it was cut in the last 3 years. So this is not new. Where did it go? It got cut. So let's just reactivate what was started. If there were some hairs on it, if there were some problems with it, I trust you. You're going to tell us about it. Quickly run through, because I think I've got 7 minutes. I'm not 100% sure, but I think I'm there. Social infrastructure, community engagement, street corner meetings, feedback, visits to sites, tells me sporting clubs, great for some. Community centres, great for some. Libraries, great for some. Dog parks, amazing, great for some. Except when you put terrible pine chips down that collect all the doggy doo around them and they look like some big turd with a Lamington kind of thing in a bag. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. No, and as for the little Duffy dog's paws, they are shockers. They get all cut up, but dog parks. One-on-one basketball courts. Who knew? Fantastic. That one comes out of Harlem, right? There's good things, and it's about getting kids together and doing the thing. And then, broadly, community and loneliness and well-being and health needs to be at the heart of all decisions. Transport, infrastructure, health, clearly, education, treasury. Where are we going? Where is the hierarchy of needs? Because if you do not have the social infrastructure, the social capital investment, you can build the bricks and mortar, but you do not have the people to do the job. You don't have the skills to do the job. You don't have the energy to do the job. You will not achieve self-actualisation as a community. You need to build a cat on it. It is not what is happening. Thank you very much.
Incredibly engaging, these conversations, aren't they? We go from bark chips, doggy doo, cotton wool. I'm so glad you brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Who's got that stamped in their DNA? You know, thinking back to the old uni days, but so pertinent. You know, let's get back to the basics sometimes and think about that underlying structure, which says, in order for us to be sustainable, healthy, empowered going forward, we need to look at the core need, which is community connectedness. It's not only about clean air, water, etc. But moving more onto the sort of environmental theme, I'd like to welcome our representative today, Robert Sims, member of the Legislative Council representing Greens SA. Robert, the Greens, of course, not only speak about all things green, but green is really part of the DNA of so many other areas, and I know the Greens are particularly strong in their advocacy on higher education, for example, on marriage equality, climate change. climate change, and public transport, which I think is a really interesting one. Is there a relationship between public transport and loneliness? So I welcome you up to the lectern to talk to us about that and all things green.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's really refreshing to be out of the Zoom room and to be able to have some face-to-face conversations with you all. And, you know, thinking about the events that are unfolding overseas at the moment, we are so lucky in our democracy, in the middle of an election campaign, to be able to have these face-to-face discussions. And I feel very fortunate to be able to follow these formidable speakers, though it is a bit of a daunting thing to be last on a panel speaking among this crowd. I guess the first thing I'd say is, like Connie, the Greens are not going to be vying to be in government this election. I'll let Nat and Michelle duke that one out here today. But we are looking to play an important role in the next Parliament as a balance of power party in the upper house that can hold whoever is in government to account and to ensure that they take action on the things that are important for South Australians. And I think this pandemic has demonstrated to all of us that loneliness is a challenge for us all and something that needs to be confronted by government. We definitely need a statewide strategy that addresses social isolation and loneliness, and that includes adequate funding for things like social infrastructure, services, healthcare, education, housing, and, of course, transport. Supporting people to have meaningful social relationships and interactions is simply crucial to people's physical and mental health. And, you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. You work in this sector. But I saw a survey back from 2017 that said that 1 in 4 Australians feel lonely on 3 or more days a week. 1 in 4. Interestingly, the report found that those living in neighbourhoods where at least 30% of nearby land was parks or reserves had 26% lower odds of becoming lonely compared to their peers in areas with less than 10% green space. And for people living on their own, those associations were even greater. In areas with 30% or more green space, the odds of becoming lonely halved. And so we talk about the connections between green and mental health and loneliness. Absolutely, protecting our green space is vitally important. I had cause to reflect a bit on this over the last few years. I live on my own. I'm an extrovert, so for me going out and talking to people is a really important thing. I guess it's one of the reasons why I enjoy working in politics. But, you know, a few years ago when we had the lockdown period, I was working from home for a prolonged period of time, wasn't seeing colleagues on a daily basis. You were hard-pressed to find anywhere that was open that you could linger in. And for me, being able to enjoy the Adelaide parklands was a really critical thing. And I know that that public green space has been really important for people's mental health as we've dealt with the pandemic, and it needs to be protected. Given one of the Parliament's main jobs is to pass laws, to make laws that impact everybody, how often do we look at these laws and assess how they affect people's sense of isolation? Well, in our view in the Greens, we just don't do that effectively enough. And that's one of the reasons why we're really supportive of this idea of creating a dedicated Minister for Loneliness and a loneliness action plan that ensures that every new social and economic piece of legislation is viewed through the lens of how it impacts on people's ability to connect with each other. And that's something that we would love to see the Labor and Liberal parties make happen in the next government. Since the onset of the pandemic, levels of life satisfaction have declined across the board. Now, more than ever, is the time for government to be investing all they can in the mental well-being of citizens, and creating a dedicated ministry is one way to do this. It has been done in other places around the world, as Connie mentioned. Over in Japan, they did this in direct response to the pandemic. Over in the UK, they did this back in 2018, and there's a push to establish this portfolio over in Victoria that's underway at the moment. What would a strategy around loneliness look like here in South Australia? Well, fundamentally, we need to build a kind of community that nurtures mental health and well-being by promoting participation, connection, and minimises loneliness and isolation. We need to put the individual at the heart of all of our solutions, recognising the role that all of us can play in making a difference. And this kind of strategy could include working with businesses to support employees with mental health concerns, getting cross-portfolio government departments on board, and encouraging people to build those connections with their communities. And of course, in doing that, we can also reduce stigma. What would the new minister do? Well, they would have a whole-of-government strategy to reduce the stigma affecting loneliness, ensure the impact of loneliness is considered when developing social and economic legislation. This could be done through a loneliness impact statement for all legislation. Improve the evidence base on loneliness, making a compelling case for action and ensuring everybody has the information that they need. And of course, working very closely with the non-government sector and experts in the area. The other point I want to make is we recognise that loneliness is part of some significant structural challenges. Things like, failure to invest in transport, things like failure to invest in digital education and ensuring that those resources are made available for everybody. I spoke before about being trapped in the Zoom room. It was interesting, yesterday I spoke at a forum for COTA with people from the Council of the Ageing, and one of the key challenges for people in that demographic is being able to access technology and being able to engage at a time when face-to-face interactions aren't possible. And government has an important role to play in making sure that everybody is able to access that sort of technology. We also need to look at the support for people in the regions, which is so often left behind. And we do need to ensure certainty of funding for vital services like community centres and make sure that they're prioritised by government. So certainly I can give you a commitment on behalf of the Greens that for us in the new Parliament, fighting for action on these things will continue to be a key priority. And for my colleague Tammy Franks and I, social justice, health and well-being, ensuring that every person in the community feels included irrespective of where they live. These things are key priorities for us in the Greens, and they'll continue to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we have another round of applause for our four guests up on the stage? Right, question time. Are you ready? I'm not sure, Mark, do we have lots of questions or are these? Oh, brilliant. Okay. Thank you. Well, let's start at the top from Robin. Funding is often directed at the crisis end. Addressing loneliness is an important early intervention, and I think you've all spoken to that point. How can we ensure that early intervention approaches are funded? Now, there is a mic next to your seat, and first in, best dressed.
I'm happy to start. This is an excellent question and something that in other parts of my portfolio we've tried to focus very much on. So particularly with domestic and family violence, where there's been record amounts of funding spent and we've had the capacity to increase programs courtesy of the Commonwealth Government through the National Partnerships funding. So with domestic violence, we're trying to push the issue upstream, if you like, so before it gets to the crisis end. So we've got a framework that guides that, which is the Women's Safety Strategy, so that there's more of the community-based funding. So we've got the safety hubs in regional areas, which is that entry point for women to access information, because a lot of people don't always know that that's what they're experiencing. So that is very much a focus of our government, and also through the reforms of the homelessness system, prevention is very much a key strategy. So we'd obviously be very interested in some sort of framework that this sector would be working towards in terms of ensuring that we do have that prevention in, because obviously there's less trauma for people, and also it means that it's more effective. Thank you. Nat, you look like you were...
I think in terms of early interventions, there's a lot of ways you can look at it. We've already announced a heap of policies where we're talking about investment in schools to strengthen and support young people with their challenges, to ensure that they've got access to therapists. So I think from a point of view of funding programs, that's just one example, but funding programs in schools, and that's my heart, it's my belief that powerful narrative and connected programs for young people build stronger futures. And I think we've acknowledged over many decades now, where you talk about creating crisis for life around youth incarceration, around people who perhaps become recidivists. The younger they become recidivists, the longer they end up being incarcerated, and more likely they are to be lifetime recidivists. So I think there is a generational approach that we're committed to around starting where young people are, but also I think some of the big social change funding pools that have happened over the years, such as the NDIS, have gone way off track in some areas and made it very, very difficult for people to access. So I'm definitely committed to sit down at a table with the federal government and try and nut this out about where the gaps have been created because of the way the bureaucracy has been set up and the block funding has been cashed out. I think there is investments that can be made for people when you recognise the potential risk.
Thanks, Nat. Connie.
I'll go next. Thank you. Not I'll go next. I'm not telling you I'll go next. Sorry.
They're so polite, aren't they?
I think one of the things that stands out to us is, it's always the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. And we know, I said before, I pointed to $58 per person. That's what we spend in South Australia on preventative health. My main frustration with these issues is that we don't look at them holistically. We look at everything with a silo mentality. We need to be looking at this holistically, because whether we're talking about isolation or loneliness or mental health or obesity or all those other issues that I referred to when I spoke before, they're all interrelated. So prevention has to be key, and that's where our funding needs to be focused. And if I can give you the worst and most harrowing example, I don't think this will ever leave me, but I heard it at a forum that I attended a few months ago, and it concerned the Dondale incident. And Dr. Kong, who's an ENT specialist, spoke at that event and said that incident, the Dondale incident, could have been potentially avoided if the young man in question had had an appropriate ear and hearing assessment. He could not hear the instructions that were being told to him that day. That is about early intervention and prevention. That's where the focus needs to be. That's where our funding needs to be directed.
Thank you, Connie.
Can I just add, yes, I totally agree with what's been said, and often we don't tend to put the emphasis on early intervention because the focus is always on the crisis response. I guess the only other thing I'd add is that we've got to look at the structural issues too that contribute to loneliness, and by that I mean the things that cause stigmatisation, discrimination, those things are so often a contributing factor. And, something I often reflect on as a gay man, a lot of the people that I know growing up who are in the LGBTI community have confronted these issues from time to time because they've been discriminated against or excluded on the basis of sexuality, and it's true for so many other groups. So there's got to be a focus as well around addressing those structural issues so that we can ensure that everybody feels included in our society.
Thank you. there's lots of questions. So I might, get one response per question going forward so we can get through as many as possible. But actually, the previous slide, I just had a question. I don't know if we can go back.
I think I'm being verbal, but it's being discussed at the table, shall we say, and we'll have a conversation later about it.
Can I just add on that? I've got a private members bill before the Parliament to do that, so I'd be very keen to get the major parties on board.
We support raising the age to 14.
So the next question, which political party is willing to address the fact that South Australian community centres are significantly less supported and funded than those in other states? That's hitting the nail on the head, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm happy to just provide a brief response if others want to continue. I think I acknowledge that in my speech that there is no raise in the funding for 15 years if the current proposal goes ahead. And also there is a massive cut to the numbers of people who will get funding in the modelling that I've been shown. So I'm happy to be advised differently, but I think the community centres in the room here would object to any alternate advice on that. So I am aware that that contract is not ready to be done currently, so it'll be done in the next government. I commit to consult with community centres and the sector generally to see whether that is the model we should be using.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yes, so just in relation to the DHS round, DHS, I believe, and has the track record of being very, very consultative on any proposed reforms. So, and I've spoken to, senior executives in the last 24 hours about this just to see where that was at. So I understand that comments need to be received by the end of the week. They've identified that across the centres there's large inequities, and so when we've looked at other areas that we fund, for instance, the Safer Families program, which is for all the families that are pre-statutory for, before child protection needs to step in. They did some very deep consultation in that space to make sure that they got it right. So I've got every confidence in that department that they will listen to the sector going forward and take all those concerns into consideration. And if I can just add too that there are, and I've mentioned a couple of them in my speech, the community hubs, there's also children's centres and the Faith Fuller Foundation. So they are very much community centre, very similar activities as well. So maybe we need to get you the data on how much funding goes into those.
Thanks, Michelle. All three of you have talked about the kind of multi-sectorial context of loneliness. It relates to planning and health and education and employment, etc. So a question. Loneliness action plan, a loneliness statewide strategy. What's the chances of getting that on the books going forward?
I think it's a great idea. So those sorts of strategies inform frameworks, guide everybody, and there's been a lot of discussion. I think the guest speaker who was on before us as well talked about how making sure that everyone in the sector is working collaboratively, which I'm sure community centres do anyway, but just helps to identify a whole range of things in the system that might be potentially being overlooked when there's not a light shone on it.
Look forward to consulting on it, totally. It's a great idea.
Great, in the pipeline, big tick. A question around carers, unpaid carers. 1 in 3 children in a classroom can be a young unpaid carer. What a tragic statistic that is. Intervention targeted at 15 to 17-year-olds have significant positive outcomes. What are your thoughts and offerings around that?
Very quickly again, so we've talked about investing in schools to make sure there are professional people available to deal with early issues that are identified. That would include young people who are carers because they need people to talk to, they need people to have advice. I understand reforms that it's really difficult, right, to make exact, precise commitments and dollar commitments, because there are a range of reforms, and you've all felt them over the past 3 to 6 years, state and federal, that have changed the landscape. Some of that will need to be unpicked. Some of it can be built on, some will need changing. So there's already some commitments in the pipeline around early intervention. For young carers at a high risk, absolute focus.
I might add to that, and it'll be basically the same as what I said before, silo mentalities. Child protection, CAMS, mental health, Women's and Children's Hospital, they are all interconnected, and the way that we address these issues are all interconnected, but we deal with them with a silo mentality. There's one program that was being run at the Women's and Children's Hospital. It's the infant trauma program, the single most preventative form of trauma in infants. First 1,000 days. $200,000 for that program to help 25 of the most vulnerable cohort of kids in the state. It was axed. They are the sorts of programs that feed into the sorts of issues that we've just addressed. CAMS, child protection. These kids are the ones who are going to end up in the child protection system when we continue axing these programs. So we need to stop that silo mentality. We need to look at this holistically, and we need to keep those sorts of programs in place.
In the last Grants SA funding round, which we announced just before Caretaker, we've provided funding to Carers SA to look at what can be done to support young carers in schools more. So that whoever's in government should help to inform how we can better support younger carers going forward.
Thank you. And I can see there is a bit of a theme here about acknowledging previous programs that you talked about Together SA, which was very much around cumulative impact and a whole of a statewide approach. We've talked about the trauma informed for very young people. Sometimes it's not about coming up with whiz-bang new ideas. Sometimes it's a matter of looking at what we have within the infrastructure and learning from that. I think we've got time maybe for, I'll say, 2 more questions. Is there anything from the floor, those of you that didn't feel comfortable putting it into Slido? We've certainly got many more questions up here. But I'm happy to take a question from the floor if anyone would like to ask one. Alcohol and drug use is certainly very much a symptom of loneliness. Social responses, though, often inhibit connectedness. Criminalisation, stigma, poor education, etc. How do we actually address those underlying challenges?
Happy to jump in really fast on this as well. I am on record as absolutely believing in harm minimisation approaches. We have announced some funding for drug and alcohol rehabilitation and recovery programs that are acknowledging that this is a health issue and needs to be treated as such. So Labor is definitely on a journey to bring some change. But also, I think there needs to be acknowledgement that, again, there has been other programs in the community that had knock-on effects that weren't actually directly drug and alcohol, but they certainly connected with people regarding this, such as some of the Shine programs that have been cut and have left a massive hole in our community, and they were cut in the last 3 years as well. And those people who had amazing skills and intellectual capacity and love for the people that came to their clinics did not just deal with sexual health issues, they dealt with drug and alcohol problems, addiction, counselling. That's a disgrace.
In relation to these issues, there is often a lot of intersectionality, as I think a lot of the speakers have articulated today. And we saw when we had one of the rounds, whatever year it was, 2020, I think, of COVID, when with the people who were rough sleepers, and we placed them in hotels. There was a lot of people who we housed in hotels who really struggled in that system and would, had some challenges, shall we say. So we've got a program that we've started, which is, well, I think Uniting Country. Sorry, Simon. I always get you mixed up. You know that. Simon's organisation is a partner with us at the Holbrooks which is some converted housing SA properties, so that those people can get the on-site support that they need, because without that they struggle to maintain successful tenancies. So we're really interested in seeing what the outcomes of that are, because, you know, housing first is the mantra of our homelessness services now, but we know that you often need those wraparound supports as well, so that you can get the help that you need.
I might add to this one. If we think what we're doing around drug addiction in this jurisdiction is working, we're all absolutely kidding ourselves. Absolutely kidding ourselves. If you think there are enough placements out there for people with drug addiction or alcohol addiction, you are absolutely kidding yourselves. And successive governments, and I say this to both of you, should absolutely hang their heads in shame in terms of the level of funding that they've provided to those services. SA Best has probably once stepped outside its realm of saying that we'll always be guided by experts in the know, and we do have a mandatory drug rehab policy that we have pushed for years. The Liberals actually supported that policy, but one of the reasons why we put that policy in place is because we knew that the voluntary spots simply weren't available. So if you want to force a government's hand in terms of putting voluntary spots in place, then provide them with a mandatory drug rehab program as well. I know that that's not particularly popular amongst the civil libertarians, one of which I am, but I've seen firsthand, and I see every single day of my life firsthand, the impacts of drug addiction. Not one person in this room or either side of me is going to convince me that we've done anywhere near enough around drug addiction.
Can I just say, the Holbrooks thing, I've visited the site, I've spoken to the people. It's just started, and it is only funded till June. So it would be interesting to see what your thoughts are regarding how that continues.
Well, everything needs to be evaluated, because we want to make sure that what we're doing works. So, I
thought you just said it worked.
Well, it's early days, Nat. So, you know, in fairness to programs, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And, you know, if things aren't working, the definition of madness is doing the same thing and expecting a different outcome, which is why we reformed homelessness services, because that was very disconnected, and now it's on a pathway where the client's very much at the focus.
Do you know what? That leaves us with no more time. Do what you always have done, and you'll always get the same results. We've heard that, and I think we've heard in differing ways some very strong commitments to looking at the importance of early intervention, the importance of looking at the issue around loneliness holistically. It doesn't just sit within the human services, the not-for-profit space. It encompasses every element across a government and a not-for-profit portfolio. And most importantly, I think we've had a commitment to at least a willingness to explore a statewide loneliness strategy in recognition of that multi-sectoral approach. So on behalf of everyone here, thank you so very much to you all for sharing both your personal and political insights today. Thank you.
You've only got 30 seconds of me. Thank you, each of you, for that. The personal is political, isn't it? And it was really interesting in terms of the initial presentations, how much you shared of the impacts in your own lives. And I think that's why it's such a fundamental issue for us to be addressing as a community and politically as well. So thank you for being so frank and open and sharing those things. And it's why we have to continue to elevate this topic more broadly outside of this group of people into the general community. And Robert, thanks for kicking that off on ABC this morning as well. That was good, and got a bit of profile for what we're doing today, but more importantly, the profile about this topic. So thanks so much for giving your time generously. I wish you all the best over the next how many days is it? No, 18, but who's counting indeed. It's a pretty tough time, isn't it, as you're out there going to many of these sorts of engagements. But thanks for spending time with us here today. Just very briefly, before we go for morning tea, we've got about 20 minutes for morning tea. When you come back, we're doing the parallel sessions. So for those people who are wanting to explore more about the skills and the art of the connector, the sort of topic that was introduced earlier from Jane, that'll be in this room. And those that have and want to be involved in a focus on young people and overcoming loneliness, that'll be happening in the room right opposite. I think that's to the west. I think I've got my directions right. Anyway, it's the room next door. So after morning tea, if you come back into those respective rooms, and then you'll be able to engage in those sessions. So just finished by another big round of applause for our